Well, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a professor of health policy at Stanford University. He has boldly said that the COVID pandemic has been one of the most politically and culturally divisive events in American history. He's probably right about that. He was shadow banned on social media because of his views of opposing lockdowns, opposing long school closures, and other measures that he says did nothing but harm Americans, and that we should all be outraged. Well, I think we are. He was one of the originators of the Great Barrington Declaration, which brought real science to the COVID issue early on from some of the world's leading doctors and scientists. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I heard you early in the pandemic when all these people were saying they were scientists, and you made a statement that I said, that's the most sensible thing I've heard, and here it was. You said it was the first time in history that we isolated the healthy people instead of just isolating the people who are sick. That didn't seem that it should be controversial to make that statement.
Really shouldn't have been. For a century, the way we managed respiratory virus pandemics was we found out who's vulnerable, cared for them, tried to protect them as best we could, and didn't disrupt the lives of everybody else, because we knew that harming those, disrupting the lives of kids, disrupting the lives of the poor, disrupting the lives of the working class, what it would do, it was harm those folks with absolutely no benefit for the people who are most vulnerable. And we could have done that during this pandemic, Governor.
Well, I mean, you've been proven to be right, you and some of the others in the Great Barrington Declaration. And it's been now evident that we were being lied to by federal officials, Dr. Collins, Tony Fauci. They were all over the board, but ultimately, they said things that weren't true, that masks, first they said they wouldn't work, then they said we had to have them, we would die without them, that we had to have the vaccine, but if we had the vaccine, we couldn't give it to anyone and we couldn't get it. All of that was a lie.
Yeah, and they said that if you got COVID and recovered, it didn't count for anything, even though it's actually pretty good protection.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people that lost their jobs over this exact issue. A lot of kids, a year and a half of school. My kids were didn't see it inside a classroom for a year and a half. I mean, and you know, it was one of these things where, in order to create this crazy policy, they had to make this idea that they had the consensus behind them.
Yeah.
That's why they called me fringe. That's why they had to dismiss and shadow ban and do all these tactics that don't belong anywhere near science. Because if there's no consensus, you can't do those things that harm so many people.
Recently, when the Twitter files got uncovered, you were able to see firsthand that there were people inside of Twitter that specifically targeted you to shut you down.
I think it's even worse than that. So I actually got to meet Elon. He invited me to go up to Twitter headquarters. I was put on a blacklist. So it's the craziest thing. So what that meant is that I could write a message. I didn't even know I was on the blacklist. So I would write the message, my followers would see it, but it never went to anybody else.
But what can we do to make sure this never happens to us again?
I think you write your representatives and tell them the American people deserve an honest, bipartisan commission to assess what happened during the pandemic. After the Challenger disaster in 1986, space shuttle blew up, we had a scientifically minded commission. You remember Richard Feynman, this Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he took the O-ring, dipped it in the water.
Yeah.
We need something like that.
A couple of particularly troubling things. One, even government agencies are now saying this came as a leak from the Wuhan lab. This was not bat soup from somewhere in the jungle. Is anybody going to be held accountable for the lies that they told? And did they know they were lying to us when they told us?
The best form of accountability is reform. We undertook and unfortunately, the American government, in cooperation with the Chinese, undertook very dangerous experiments. And I think that's likely what led to this deadly pandemic. We need reform so this kind of thing never happens again.
We hear, listen to the scientists, listen to the science. We've got to follow the science. But that's not what we did in this. And the CDC has destroyed their credibility, and that's not something we want to have happen.
Yeah, no, public health is very, very important. I've worked for decades in public health. I've seen firsthand the good it can do. But the confidence in public health is just in the toilet right now.
Yeah.
Because of those failures. And the CDC, probably the very worst thing that it did was that it didn't push hard enough to open schools. Sweden opened schools. They had better results in the pandemic than we did. We knew very early on that it was deadly for closing schools, and it wasn't actually helping as far as stopping COVID spread. And the CDC did not push hard enough to do that.
Did they do that because they were getting pressured from Washington and from government officials who wanted there to be a lockdown?
You know, Governor, in 2021, the teachers' unions basically told the CDC what to do.
And they did it.
And they did it.
Which is disturbing on its face. Another thing was this gain of function research. Was there something going on that we as American citizens helped fund in Wuhan because we couldn't have done it in the US, it would have been illegal? Is that one of the reasons that some of the government people here were trying to say, look elsewhere, because they didn't want us to know that we had helped pay for the very thing that caused this?
I mean, yes, we funded that laboratory in Wuhan, that it's exactly the epicenter where the virus first spread out. And we probably, I don't think it was nefarious. And the idea was that we could like predict what viruses were gonna make a pandemic. It just was an accident, is my guess.
Yeah.
It leaked out, and somebody was playing with some test tubes. They got sick. They went outside. This thing spreads very, very easily. I mean, I've had it twice myself. It's not surprising to think that it would infect a lab worker. And I mean, it was a dangerous experiment, and that we shouldn't have been doing it. But I think that at the core of it is what happened. It's the reason why so many people have suffered.
Well, I can only say this. If we ever have another one, God forbid, I hope we don't, but if we do, I hope somebody in Washington is smart enough to put you in charge of how we deal with it rather than the folks who were doing it the last time. I truly do. Thank you for your courage in standing up for all of us. Now, for our audience, you can follow Dr. Bhattacharya, Silence No More, on social media. You can actually find out what he's talking about, and it's worth following. Head to Huckabee.tv. We'll provide the links for you, and I have a feeling you're going to be quite amazed at what we were told and what we should have been told.